The Atlanta Braves have added a lot of relievers on minor league deals this offseason, but Buck Farmer, it's a little bit different. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Tuesday, February 18th, your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And this morning in the newsletter, we dropped, it's a tradition at this point, right? What the Atlanta Braves saw in reliever Buck Farmer, right? We do this every single time a guy that's interesting is signed, what the Atlanta Braves saw in this guy. We did one for Brian De La Cruz, right? Davis Daniel, all that stuff. Let's talk about Buck Farmer and how this might change up the bullpen a little bit. Later in the show, we're going to get to some of the other news from Northport, whether it's guys playing with injuries, other teams dealing with injuries that will impact the Braves and things like that. But let's get to Buck Farmer, because this is a really interesting signing. He's 33 years old. He turns 34 this week. His birthday is the 20th. So in 2 days, he will turn 34 years old. He's that Braves demographic, right? Was born in Conyers, Georgia, went to high school there, went to Georgia Tech. So it's a local kid coming home, things like that. But I don't think people realize maybe how good Buck Farmer has been in the last couple seasons and how he could even improve off of that in 2025. So he just finished up a three years with the Cincinnati Reds. And the first 2 years were fine, right? 3.83 ERA in 2022, 4.20 ERA in 2023, and what's notable there, 75 innings in 71 starts. The dude can pitch innings. In 2024, he actually made one start. He finished a lot more games than he previously had. So 61 games, 71 innings, ERA of 3.04. 3.04. He earned, on Baseball Reference, 1.7 WAR in 2024 without getting a lot of saves. Like 3 wins, 1 save, but he wasn't a closer, and he finished with 1.7 WAR. Here's a fun fact for you. Do you know how many relievers on the Braves last year had 1.7 or better WAR? The answer is exactly 2. Isel Iglesias had 2.9. Joe Jimenez had 1. So if he had done what he did in Atlanta's pen last year, he would have had one of the better reliever ERAs. He would have had the third most WAR of anybody. And Atlanta got him on a minor league deal. Like, we don't have official financial information, but I'm willing to bet it's probably close to league minimum if he makes the roster. Whereas last year, he made $2.25 million with the Reds. They probably have him on the minor league minimum if he makes the roster at all, right? Now, just that in and of itself is, I talked yesterday, talking about the Alex Anthopoulos thing, about how the Braves are very insistent on finding value in their deals. In this free agency class, teams have been spending roughly $8 million per WAR on players. So if he gives you 1.7 WAR on, let's say, $1 million, the minor league minimum, it's roughly around $1 million. That's amazing value. That's exactly the type of addition that the Braves like to make. And just another reason why I don't see them going out and paying a super competitive price for a guy like David Robertson, simply because they fully believe they can find things like this. Now, there are a little bit of caveats here on Buck Farmer, right? There's a reason why nobody had signed him yet. We don't know what that is. We can look at a couple things I'm going to give you a few of those. But I've also got a couple ways where I think he could be better in 2025 than he was in previous years. So if I had to guess, the two reasons why he wasn't signed by anybody yet is, one, the worry about regression. We talked about this with Ronaldo Lopez, about how his actual ERA of 199 way outperformed his fielding independent pitching, which was like close to 3, and his expected ERA, which was close to 4. Similar situation for Buck Farmer. Actual ERA of 3.04, right? Fielding independent pitching of 4. Expected ERA of 4.14. So he did significantly outproduce the expected stats in 2024. That doesn't always mean that those players will back up to those numbers again, but statistically, you are less likely to repeat that type of overperformance of your inputs year over year. So that is something to keep in mind. A second thing is that his fastball did lose a little bit of velocity year over year. 2023, he threw exclusively a four-seamer for his fastball, 93.9 miles an hour. 2024, he was throwing both a sinker and a four-seamer, but the velocity was lower on both. The four-seamer was at 92.7, 1.2 miles an hour less, and the sinker was at 92.5, so 1.4 mile an hour less than the four-seamer the previous year. It's entirely possible teams saw that and got scared off and thought, okay, maybe something's going on, fatigue, whatever it might be. He did, again, I mentioned he had a big workload in 2023. He roughly repeated that workload in 2024. He threw 1,100, 1,200 pitches in both years. He 70-something innings in both seasons. That's a high workload. Teams may have been scared off a little bit by that. And then I do also think there is a little bit of concern about some of the peripherals aren't necessarily that great. Again, we already mentioned the fastball velo, but a lot of his ability to miss bats, chase rate, whiff rate, strikeout rate are roughly average. 56th percentile in chase rate, 29.3%. Whiff rate, 54th percentile, 26.1. Strikeout rate, 53rd percentile, 23.4%. So he's roughly league average at avoiding bats. He also has a higher than average walk rate, 9.7%. He doesn't get a ton of ground balls, 18th percentile, 36.8%, which means his barrel rate is slightly below average, 37th percentile. That may explain why some of these teams did not want to sign him in free agency, despite the fact that he gave the Reds 1.7 WAR last year without working as a closer. But there are a couple very obvious paths for the Braves to make him better, and I'll break that down next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby talking about the addition of Buck Farmer to the group of non-roster invitees that the Braves have brought in to compete for a spot in their bullpen. A little bit later, we're going to get to some of the injury news, whether it's Jarred Kelenic playing through injuries last year or significant injuries in the division with some of these other teams. But for Buck Farmer, I absolutely do believe there is a path for him to get better. Part of it is just the velocity, right? If the velocity can increase a little bit and improve a little bit, you're going to see just improvement in some of these numbers. But I do also think the switch to adding a sinker in 2024 is a big part of this here, because he was a four-seam fastball dominant guy, and it wasn't a good four-seam fastball. The stuff plus on this pitch was roughly 80, and a pitch with a stuff plus of 100 is completely average, right? That is average, is a stuff plus of 100. The four-seamer allowed a batting average of 241 in 2023 and a slug of 474. When he switched over to adding the sinker, it dramatically cut down how much he was using the four-seamer, right? He was throwing it like 40-something% of the time. He had a slider that was like 34% of the time, and a changeup in the 20s, okay? A lot of those percentages stayed the same, but again, he added the sinker, and so the fastball usage got cut in half. The four-seam fastball immediately got better, despite the lower velocity, because he wasn't throwing it as much. It went from a 241 batting average allowed to a 208. It went from a 474 slug to a 396. And that's despite him throwing it a mile an hour softer than he threw it in 2023. The flip side of this is that sinker he added wasn't that good, right? 268 average allowed, 423 slug, and he got lucky there because the expected allowed was a 315 batting average and a 516 slug. So he got lucky on the sinker. But it's still something where the fastball got better. He threw the sinker more. 24% usage on that, 19.9 on the four-seamer. But throwing the four-seamer less made it perform better because hitters were less able to sit on that specific pitch. And you see this a lot with guys when they add a new pitch. They're not always fully understanding the best times to use it. So like the usage of that sinker, the sequencing of that sinker, and a lot of that kind of stuff. He threw it mostly to righties and then threw the four-seamer mostly to lefties. And I do think there's a little bit of adjustments that you can make on pitch usage when you use them, being mixing that up a little bit more. So I expect that to get a little better. Another advantage I think you can see from Atlanta and the way that they like to work with these guys is in the slider. Those of you who are amateur pitching nerds like me, when the Braves have a guy with an outlier pitch that they acquire, especially a reliever, the big thing they like to do is have the guy throw that pitch more. Pierce Johnson's the poster child of this. He ramped up that curveball usage to 80% usage, 75% usage when they acquired him from the Rockies. And down the stretch that year, he was one of the best relievers in baseball because of that. And then you can turn around and so the slider, it's not exceptional movement or anything. It's fine, right? But it grades out really well in a lot of the models. It looks like it has more horizontal. It's not a sweeper, but it has more horizontal movement than the average slider. And in the models, the stuff models, it's a 113 stuff plus on the slider. Changeup, 98 stuff plus. So, which is good enough for your third pitch, right? So if he can adjust the mix a little bit, mix up the fastballs to the handednesses a little better, and then ramp up the slider usage from 35 to 45 or 50%, what does that do? Combined with if his velocity is back to normal, what does that do for his stuff? I think it's potentially really impactful for the Braves. I think that can be that can unlock some reliable performance in the threes, right? Again, he had an ERA in the threes in 2024, but all of the input said it should have been higher, should have been in the fours. And this works in reverse too. He had a 3.83 ERA in 2022 when his field and independent pitching was 3.03. So this works in reverse. Relievers are more prone to these swings than starters because there's just less innings to get some sort of reliable sample on this, right? But the usage of Buck Farmer is going to be really interesting too. Like, we're going to find out in spring if they want him to use these pitches differently, right? Throw the mix up when he throws the four-seamer versus the sinker, use the slider more, all that stuff. But if you put him in the pen, this does some really interesting stuff to the rest of the guys on the roster. Like, as of right now, having not seen him throw in spring, that's the big caveat here. We don't know if the velocity's back. We don't know what he's doing. But just based off pedigree and results, I've got him in that second tier of relief options along with Angel Perdomo, which you can do much worse than having Angel Perdomo and Buck Farmer as your sixth and seventh relievers out of the pen. Like, holy cow, you can do so much worse. Your 6th and 7th relievers out of the pen could be guys like Luke Jackson. We've seen that somewhat recently. Dylan Dodd came up and pitched for you out of the pen a little bit last year. This is so much better for a 6th and 7th option than some guys like that. And I do think that he would get used like a 6th and a 7th guy, right? He would be in those medium and low leverage situations. In 32 medium leverage situations for Cincinnati last year, 143 average, 557 OPS. And if you don't necessarily think that a 143 average and a 557 OPS is that great of an achievement to get from a reliever, remember that with men on base, Orlando Arcia last year had a 198 average and a 544 OPS. So in essence, he makes opposing hitters look like Orlando Arcia in medium leverage situations. You take that. You absolutely take that. And what's really good is he also has some experience as a fill-in closer. He has 6 career saves. And on this year's version of the roster, guys who are going to be on the roster on opening day, right? You have exactly one player outside of Raisel Iglesias who has saved a game with the Braves. That's Pierce Johnson. He has 2 saves. So Buck Farmer would give you another option for a guy who could step into a save situation if a lot of your key guys are gone. Because a lot of your other relievers on the roster don't have saves. Dylan Lee, Aaron Bummer, Angel Perdomo. A lot of these guys don't have saves. And we've been asking about that. Who's your backup closer? Buck Farmer could theoretically be your backup closer, a couple times a season if you need one. The biggest losers in this whole situation feels like it's a lot of the non-roster invitees, right? Because when you look at all of the options Atlanta has now, if you assume the 5 are locked in, Raisel Iglesias, Pierce Johnson, Daysbel Hernandez as your righties, Aaron Bummer, Dylan Lee as your lefties. If you assume those 5 are locked in, then after them, Angel Perdomo and Buck Farmer are probably in your pen. And then that last spot is some combination of Anderson Pilar, your Rule 5 pick, Jake Diekman, the Major League veteran, the 38-year-old, the lefty we talked about last week, Chasen Shreve, another lefty, Dylan Covey, 33-year-old veteran. You use all your young guys, your Inyel de los Santos, your Noli Paredes, like all these guys are probably just going to end up in Gwinnett. Now, we heard this on yesterday's show. AA talked about there'd be plenty of rotation, right? There'd be plenty of guys rotating through the bullpen even in the season. But from where I sit, and again, that's a place where I have not seen Buck Farmer throw since last season. From where I sit, it feels like he is probably now one of the favorites to take a spot in the pen on opening day, especially if that velocity is back to what it was in 2023 on the fastball, where he was throwing it a full mile an hour harder. In just a second, there are some injury notes that we got for both Atlanta and other teams. We'll break those down next, right here on Braves Today. Final segment of Braves Today, Lindsay Crosby talking about Atlanta Braves spring training. We just went over Buck Farmer, who was added to the roster on Sunday. And we got some interesting injury news. One, about some injuries last year, and then 2, about some injuries that are currently hampering other teams in the division. Jarred Kelenic, very polarizing player. A lot of fans think we should just trade him away or cut him or whatever. We got some reporting from everybody on the beat, but we're going to cite Justin Toscano of the AJC because he's a friend of the show, about he was dealing with some injuries last year. Oblique injury, wrist injury, foot injury. He was able to play through the injuries. He told Toscano that it was more accumulated wear and tear over the course of a season than anything. And if you think about it, there were times when you couldn't afford to give him a day off last year because you were down Ronald Acuna Jr., you were down Michael Harris. He went from being your 3rd outfielder to your number 1 outfielder in the span of a couple weeks over the summer. And despite all of that, he was still there. He was still able to play. it's not the reason he didn't play down the stretch. AA told us he didn't play down the stretch because Ramon Laureano was better. But it helps possibly explain why Ramon Laureano was better. Because Jarred Kelenic was not at 100%, which no MLB player is by the end of the season, but he was compromised enough where it was impacting his play. And you'll remember, he had spurts where he was very good. Remember when he took over at leadoff? The month of June, he batted .304 with a 900 OPS, 6 home runs, 14 RBI in the month. The month of July, he hit .137. If I had to guess, I would assume that towards the end of June and beginning of July is when some of those injuries started to accumulate. And we talked about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago. Is this Jarred Kelenic's last chance to prove that he is an everyday player in MLB? It probably is, right? Because when Ronald Acuna Jr. comes back, Profar is the everyday guy in left field. Ronald, we heard AA talk about this on yesterday's show. Ronald is going to be an everyday outfielder, and Michael Harris is in center. Kelenic's a fourth outfielder. Barring an injury, there's no way for him to play on a daily basis. But if he is healthy, this is an opportunity. Also, I've been told Tim Hires has already been working before they reported. Tim Hires was already working with Jarred Kelenic on his offense. Maybe we get a Jarred Kelenic rebound or breakout. Who knows? Other injury news in the division that legitimately can influence things down the stretch. This season in general, not down the stretch. The New York Mets have reported that Frankie Montes has a high-grade lat strain, and he's going to get shut down for 6 to 8 weeks. Now, we're 6 weeks away from opening day. He absolutely could be on the opening day roster. But one, this is a very Mets thing to happen, isn't it? You think about 2 years ago, a couple years ago it was Jacob deGrom. Last year it was Kodai Senga. This year, Frankie Montes losing a starter early. And yes, this is reinforcement for everybody who insisted that the Braves needed to make sure that they added a starter over the offseason, right? That they did not have enough guys. The Mets, I think, are in an even more pronounced situation of that than the Braves are. Kodai Senga, Sean Manaea are your 1 and 2. And then you've got Clay Holmes, who's converting from the pen to the rotation. Bernardo Lopez did last year. You've got David Peterson. And then I guess you've got Paul Blackburn and Griffin Canning. But it's not as attractive of a group as it was even a week or two ago. Holmes threw 60-something innings. Senga threw 5 innings in the regular season last year. A couple more appearances in the playoffs and got blasted. Peterson threw 120. Paul Blackburn threw 75. If you think the Braves rotation is a concern, the Mets rotation is significantly more of a concern than Atlanta's is. And so you can think of this 2 ways, right? Way 1 is it could always be worse. Way 2 is this is evidence that the Braves need to do more to bring in starters, because if the Braves have an equivalent injury like this, a number 3 or 4 guy goes down, all of a sudden now you're in a more questionable depth situation than you were entering spring. But found that really interesting. I would still argue that Atlanta and Philly are rotation-wise, a class ahead of the Mets, and then obviously 2 classes ahead of the Nationals and Marlins. And then I would argue that the Mets and Braves, from an offensive perspective, are, and this is going to be a little bit controversial, are ahead of Philly a bit. There's some guys for Philly who are not in camp, and there's a lot of questions about that Philly offense. A lot of veterans, a lot of guys in their 30s, guys who have had nagging injuries, who have underperformed. JT Realmuto missed time. He's in his 30s. Schwarber's in his 30s. Turner's in his 30s. Harper's in his 30s. Castellanos is in his 30s. They added 32-year-old Max Kepler. It's not, Realmuto's like 34. It's not a young lineup. And they do not have the organizational depth, really, to overcome any sort of injuries to their stars at the top of their lineup. So I would argue that Atlanta's the only team in the division that has a top-tier lineup and a top-tier rotation. Philly has the rotation and probably a tier 2 lineup because it's not very deep. And the Mets have a top tier lineup and a second tier rotation. You might think I'm wrong. If you do, perfectly great. I want to hear from you. Let's make it respectful. Leave it in the comments down below if you're on YouTube. You can also tweet at me. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. Show's on Twitter at Braves_today. I want to hear from you on, do you think Atlanta is in the top tier in the East in both lineup and rotation? Do you agree that where I have the other teams, that Philly has one and not the other? They have the rotation. The Mets have the lineup but not the rotation. Let me hear from you. In the meantime, if you're listening on audio, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and maybe also leave us a 5-star review. That'd be super cool. Until next time, this has been Braves Today.